Today we want to briefly go over Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. As World War I was drawing to an end and they were looking for a way to resolve the conflict in Europe, Woodrow Wilson wanted not just a cessation of the war, but to put in place something that would prevent such wars in the future. And so he proposed and came up with a 14-point plan. He proposed this 14-point plan in January of 1918, and it was part of the peace plan to end World War I. 5 of the points dealt with general ideals. Ideals meaning we want to prevent future conflicts. We don't want there to be more wars like this. So the principles on which it was based. Then 8 points of the 14 were used to resolve particular political and territorial issues. How are we going to restructure the map of Europe? Who's going to get what? What will it look like politically and territorially when this is concluded? And remember, this is Wilson's plan. He's like, here's how we can maybe solve particular political issues and solve particular territorial issues. We'll concede this and concede that. And basically it was a way to try to bring resolution to this, to be fair and equitable as much as possible, so that there would be what Wilson called, peace without losers. This gentlemanly agreement to cease hostilities, to agree to a new way of things being, and to no longer fight and scrap and squabble. So 5 on general ideals, 8 resolving particular political and territorial problems, and then 1 point where he proposed a joining of nations in order to prevent future wars and hostilities. So this League of Nations to help maintain world peace was the final point. Well, as Germany was looking at Wilson's 14 points in November of that year, based on the assumption that those 14 points would form the basis of a peace treaty, went ahead and signed an armistice. Now, an armistice is not a surrender. Germany was not saying we lose. They were saying we will cease firing on you. We will have a cessation of hostilities so that we can talk about perhaps signing a peace treaty and bringing an end to the war officially, ceasing our declarations of war, declaring peace, having a peace treaty between us. So to help negotiate this peace, we'll currently sign an armistice and no longer continue combat operations. So in November, they signed the armistice, ceasing hostilities with the assumption that Wilson's 14 points outlined in January of 1918 would form the basis of the future peace treaty. Well, in January, or in 1919, basically in Paris, when they got together to start discussing and hammering out the peace treaty, what Germany found was that even though Wilson was behind the 14 points, everyone else, the French and the British and all that, had zero interest in Wilson's ideals of this peace without losers. They definitely wanted to punish Germany and its allies. They had no interest in this idea of, hey, well, we'll just amicably separate and agree to these new things. They absolutely wanted Germany to pay a big price, economically and otherwise, territorially, because of their perception of Germany inciting and starting this war. So basically, Germany agreed based on the assumption that the treaty would be like Wilson's 14 points. In Paris in 1919, there was a lot of disagreement, and the final treaty that was pushed through actually punished Germany and the Central Powers horrendously, economically and otherwise, crippling punishments. So even though Germany had never surrendered, they were being treated as if they had surrendered. Now, I'm not taking sides in this. I'm not trying to say I'm pro-German or anything like that. I'm just saying the German side looked at it and said, here's a way for us to get out of this without being punished. The Allied side looked at it and said, Wilson, you may have some nice ideas, but we're not going for it. They definitely need to pay. And essentially then did something completely different from what Wilson had intended. Some would say, and I think you could argue it convincingly, that this ending actually helped precipitate or bring about World War II. That World War II is the real completion of World War I, that there was a temporary cessation of hostilities, but there was really no resolution to the conflict until the unconditional surrender of Germany in the 1940s. So basically then you've got the Paris meeting, and there was a big conflict there between Wilson and Cabot. Cabot definitely wanted Germany to unconditionally surrender, and they pushed for that. And of course, Wilson's pushing for his League of Nations and letting people leave with honor and all that kind of stuff, that he felt like if Germany was punished, it would just promote them wanting to continue the war and prove their point. And perhaps Wilson was right. We don't know, it didn't go the other way, but they certainly were upset by the way they were punished at the end of World War I. The League of Nations was included in the peace treaty in Paris only because of Wilson's insistence. Paris didn't want it, the French didn't want it, the British didn't want it, no one wanted it except Wilson. But Wilson said, look, I've helped broker this deal. You are going to give me something out of this. I'm letting you have your territories more than I thought you should have. I'm letting you punish Germany and all that. You're going to give me my League of Nations, because it was his idealistic hope that if the nations could come together as equals and talk to each other, and certainly not all nations, Wilson was a man of his time, and he believed only civilized nations, as he perceived civilized nations, industrialized nations, the nations of the West, they should sort of get together as benevolent, paternalistic overseers of the rest of the world and stop conflicts wherever they arose, because we were at a higher moral standard, supposedly, and were able to then adjudicate these matters in an equitable way. Now, who knows if that would ever happen, but this was Wilson's idealistic view. And so he pushed for the League of Nations, which was reluctantly included in the Treaty of Versailles and was passed. The irony is, though, that even though he forced it to be included, because he got sideways with Cabot, when it came time for the Senate to ratify the treaty and include America in the League of Nations, they refused, as a sort of slap in the face to Wilson. And therefore, America never joined the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson, the president of the United States at the time, who pushed for its inclusion. The League of Nations is the precursor in some ways, at least conceptually, to the United Nations. And this has been a basic overview of Wilson's 14 points, what they were intended to do, how it worked out, and how ultimately it failed. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.